Hello YouTube! Welcome to another country tips video. I've done something similar with my first video on Botswana, but I got turned off this format. It takes a little bit longer than playing through and throwing out tips, and that was especially true when I thought only 5 people would be interested. But I've got a better mic now, and it seems like maybe 25 people are interested, so I'm gonna up the production quality a bit and give you the best Mongolian tutorial that's out there, guaranteed. Mongolia, it's a landlocked country in Asia. It's got a few unique distinctions. It's the least densely populated country in the whole world, and I thought Canada was sparse. Roughly half of the population lives in the capital of Ulaanbaatar, and roughly another third lives semi-nomadically. So that should give you some sense of what kind of coverage we're likely to see. I value your time a lot, so I've even gone through and I've outlined what I'm going to cover. So first, we start with how to identify Mongolia, how to know you're in the country. If you're a veteran player, you could probably skip ahead a few minutes. You might learn something, but after that, we break down Mongolia into 5 geographical regions, and that definitely can help anybody to get better with their guesses, to get higher scores. The Google car meta in Mongolia is super useful because all of the Google cars have their own specific places where they will go. Um, Although a lot of the coverage is still dominated by one big Google car that's hard to tell apart. And then with some of the other meta that I'll cover, then we'll go into major cities in Mongolia. And that, even though it starts to become like memorization, I think that's super useful because it helps cement the tips we've just talked about. You can kind of guess what these cities should look like. And there are very few, or not very few, there are a few very good city-specific tips that can help you just instantly know where you are in Mongolia, way better than just randomly guessing Ulaanbaatar. And you want to be there for those. There are a few miscellaneous extras too. We'll cover that when we get to it. But a few basics of Mongolia. You usually don't need these to know you're in the country, but we've got the bollards. They're red and white. They're seen throughout the country. There's 2 types of license plates, one a bit taller, one a bit wider. Despite my best efforts, I've never been able to find a use for them. They seem to be distributed equally throughout the country. And then a lot of cities, not necessarily Ulaanbaatar, but smaller cities have these city-specific street lamps. They're really pretty. Uh, they can help you ID a city right away. They're also really hard to remember, not really reliable because cities will use different types, but I thought I'd throw them up here. Um, Talking about how these streetlights are hard to remember. Another thing that's hard to remember is there's a lot of text in Mongolian. It's super useful. Sometimes it'll say a city name, it'll say something you want to know. It's all in Cyrillic, which I'm really still not good at reading. Um, it's even more annoying than seeing a sign in Cambodian because I feel like I should be able to know what it's saying, but I can't. Uh, I'm not going to cover this, but if you're using this as a video guide, I'm just going to remove my camera here. Feel free to pause for a refresher. I won't be focusing on any Cyrillic in the video. By far, the easiest way to recognize Mongolia, though, is with the Google car or Google truck pictured here. And the most characteristic feature is the blanket with supplies on top. So from the back, you see a spare tire on the side. You've got the roof rack that you might find in other countries. But in the front, you see a very Mongolian car. And the majority of cars have the full blanket as pictured in the top left. But there are also cars with half-filled cargo racks here in the bottom left, where the rack's completely removed, the empty rack down here on the right. So most of these are only in specific areas. So it's super useful to improve your Mongolia guesses. You also sometimes get even the snorkel. Where's a good example here on the right? And that's something else you might get in Kenya. But I won't give any tips on differentiating Mongolia from Kenya, but I'll just let you know that if you confuse them in the game, you die in real life, which is a bummer. Um, Recognizing the Mongolian scenery isn't too hard either. Mongolia's steppes are very grassy. You've got Gobi Desert in the south, a mixture of mountains and flats throughout the country, and then you've got the city here. It's all overwhelmingly cold with few trees, cold looking anyway, because it's so high. Well, the cities look very Soviet with the classic like brutalist architecture. So if cold, treeless, and brutalist don't scream vacation to you, I don't know what will, but That's what Geoguessr vacations are for. And this is a map of all of the Google coverage in Mongolia. It's a frustrating map to remember because there's a lot of broken coverage and there's also a lot of unconnected coverage between cities. There's cities that aren't connected to anything but are covered pretty well. It also has 3 cities named Orkhon and other duplicates like that, so it gets hard to remember. In general, there's a lot of coverage in Ulaanbaatar, and you should expect one location there every time you play a round of 5 locations in Mongolia if you're doing the official map. Then there's very little coverage in the southwest and a little bit else, a little bit of coverage distributed throughout the rest. If I can find my mouse. Speaking of the Gobi Desert, it's one of my 5 general regions for guessing better in Mongolia. It's here in red, and all of the regions are up at the top. So obviously, it's not a science, and particularly near the intersection of colors, take everything with lots of exceptions. But it's really just 2 rules. It gets more and more hilly the further you go west, and it gets more and more green the further you go north. So that means you've got flat grasslands in the east, rocky mountains in the west, and it's a lot of desert in the south. Generally, you're going to find trees only when you go to the far north, but there's definitely trees throughout, especially in the cities, you'll find trees anywhere. But in rural areas, mostly you just find trees in the north, but with lots of exceptions, like I said. But if you see a lot of trees, you're in the north. And so here are a few pictures to help you pull out what I'm saying. So there's mountains out west. They're generally pretty sheer rock, even at the base. There's like no trees, no grass, and there's various varying levels of grass surrounding them in and around the cities. In the north, we get trees. Most of these are Mongolian larches, which turn really pretty colors in the fall. Um, the east, fairly self-explanatory, usually short grass, only small hills, if any hills. And the grass is often much greener than in other regions, probably just because more of the coverage is in the summer. The blue regions are the hardest to identify. They're easy to confuse. But if you look for the absence of large mountains and the absence of green grass, often you get a lot of this kind of dry, wintry spring coverage. Um, I'm sure you'll find lots of strays, but not a true desert either, I guess, because the last one is the desert regions. You've got the road that goes south pretty much directly from Ulaanbaatar, and then you've got the southeast road. Both of these look very desert-like, and they're easiest to identify the regions, but it's pretty tough to actually pinpoint it because the roads are pretty straight and it can be similar throughout. So the next easiest tip to remember for Mongolia is the Google car meta. And then just pray that you never get any trekker coverage, because there definitely is trekker coverage. Mostly you want to differentiate the full rack and the no rack. So that's full rack up top left and no rack on the top right. That's probably 95% of the coverage easily between the two. The bottom 2 trucks are like free guesses if you can remember where they are. So I'm not highlighting the full rack areas because that's everything, that's the default. But the no rack truck shown here, it's the second most common, and it's super useful because it cuts this broad diagonal through the country, which itself shows off a big change in the geography and all of that in Mongolia. So there's desert coverage that starts with the border with China here, and it's easy to remember, I guess, because there's this nice major road border with China, which one has the no rack car. And then it goes all the way up to the northern city of Erdenet. I used to call this the Erdenet car when I was learning it out. The half-packed rack is always close to the capital. It's either urban coverage in downtown Ulaanbaatar, or it's rural coverage just south of the city on this little ring road that circles some mountains. And then finally, the empty rack. Hopefully you can all see that well in the video. It's a very niche car found in this tiny region southwest of the capital. If you really want to remember to guess it correctly, try to remember the city of Karakoram and then just guess just south of there. It's just pretty snowy coverage. So speaking of snow, it's a really useful clue. For whatever reason, I didn't actually highlight the coverage we just looked at south of Karakoram, right where the M in Mongolia is, kind of on this map. But otherwise, there's some snow coverage in the capital, and there's a lot of snow coverage on the road that goes northeast of the capital up to the city of Darkhan. So a lot of that coverage intersects directly with the no rack coverage. as shown in the picture. Hopefully you can see. And then the other spot I've highlighted is trekker coverage for the ice festival on Lake Kovsgol. We'll talk about it. So armed with that knowledge, I want to look at the major cities, and this runs the risk of turning into brute memorization or a little more boring, but I think it's really useful for anyone who's watched this far because we get to practice all those tips, those basic tips, put them together, and there are some free tips to just get pinpoint guesses in the cities if you can remember them. So here are the majority of Mongolian cities with a lot of coverage, and I've color-coded them by geography. But of course, there's a lot of cities and towns I can't highlight, and sometimes the city geography isn't perfect to what it looks like just outside of the city because people plant trees and they pave grass and things like that. So I'll start with the capital of Ulaanbaatar, center of the country. As we've covered, it should be a good mix of flat and hilly. It's green, but not too green. And almost all of the Google car meta is possible there. So this is one thing to just memorize. It's right in the center. This is the Genghis Khan statue by Peace Avenue, which is the main street of the capital. And don't you dare say that Genghis Khan shouldn't be on Peace Avenue. It's fine. It's fine. The northern suburbs look like a never-ending roll of houses and yurts. It gets quite mountainous just north of the main city too, but um, often you can just tell on Batar if you have a good view. It's like, oh, there's houses here and there's another house a kilometer away and another house 2 kilometers away, which isn't true of most Mongolian cities. And then here's just some more coverage to give you a sense of possible views. Because the city's so large, so sprawling, it's almost always a good guess if you don't know where you are. And it's a good centralized hedge too. So next I'll start out east. If you're paying attention, you should expect this to be very flat, grassy, very green. And Kalkgol, it's a small town, but you land there a lot on the official map. It's recognizable by these characteristic small hills just west, an otherwise flat landscape. And I'm almost also highlighting it because of the Kalkgol Victory Museum. Most of the indoor coverage in Mongolia is either in the capital or pretty close to it, but this museum features a lot more communist war imagery than most normal art museums, so it's easy to recognize, and it's so far out too that you will get a pretty bad score if you guess Ulaanbaatar. Choibalsan is a much larger, more industrial town in the grasslands, so make make sure you pick the big city, not the smaller town with the same name nearby. But here's some typical coverage: flat, nice enough streets. The grass isn't very green here, but it's also the grass here, which has been driven over too much, I think. Um, when you're close to the city, you can see slightly greener grass. This is a view from outside the city. Again, very flat. Now, the big tip for Trebalsan is this single smokestack in the center of town, and it's almost always visible in all of the coverage. It was in both of the previous pictures too. You can feel free to go back, pause. It can be hard to see. Actually, I'll just do it because it's at the very end of the street here is the single smokestack. Here it's kind of off to the right, this little blue tall building. It makes there's one other city with a smokestack meta that we'll get to, but it makes Trevelsan quite recognizable and easily to pinpoint if you can find it. Um, Burnout is harder. It's in a grassy area, but the city itself looks so barren that I placed it with the desert colors. So here's some typical coverage: flat, very sunny. I mean, obviously all the weather hints are not necessarily city characteristics, but it was sunny when the Google car went through. Pretty street lights, but they're not reliable as hints. A picture like this shows you why you might think you're further in the desert, but Barnard, very normal Google car meta, and that's one of the useful distinctions. It's also just very flat, and it has a lot of fenced areas like this. They fence in their yards. Um, so if we compare that to other largest cities in the desert, we get different Google car meta, right? Remember that this is the no rack meta that goes all along this diagonal. So here's the no rack. We've got an Eiffel Tower ripoff in the background. I've never actually been able to use that in a round, but this is Saint-Chand. And then entering the city, you get to see how desert-like it looks. The highways make it look even more obviously desert-like. If you're trying to differentiate towns in the desert, it's more difficult. It's where streetlight meta becomes the most tempting. But Zamin Ud is the border town, and it has a lot of specific hints, so it's easier to tell. Again, we have no rack truck, desert coverage. Of all the streetlights, the one useful meta that I can actually remember is that these sailboats here are on that border town with China. The Taoist monument is pretty visible too. That reminds me of China. And then the last thing is this snaking script that's on a lot of the streetlights also reminds me that I'm on the border with China, although it shouldn't. It's obviously not Chinese characters. It's also not the old Mongolian Suyombo script. I have no idea what it is, but a memory trick is a memory trick. This is on the border with China. And the final desert lake city is Delenzadgad, although it's barely desert-like. The main difference from the last two is that because we're off the no rack diagonal, we should expect the normal Google car. And we get the normal Google car here. We also get a lot of evening coverage, which is really useful for remembering where you are. More evening coverage here. It's pretty flat, but we do have mountains to the south, and we have a smokestack, similar to Trebalsan. And this is the other city where that can be the meta, is to recognize the smokestack. I sometimes stupidly confuse the two early on for sure, and you might as well, but there are some taller buildings in downtown here, so it's not always as visible from Delenzadgad, but if you think you're there because the evening coverage and it's a little desert-like, it's not very green, um, see if you can find smoke rising from one particular point. So now we're going to change geography drastically. We're going to move to one of the easiest cities to pinpoint, and you could almost guess why if you remember the old maps. Darkon is on both the no rack diagonal car meta, and it's in the center of the snow map, and it really shows. So there are a few other cities that can have some snow in Mongolia, mostly Ulaanbaatar, but Darkon definitely has the most. Here's another picture. Whenever we see a solid foot of snow on the side of the road, you're probably either in Darkon or at least near Darkon. Erdenet is much harder to ID. It's not snowy in that coverage, and this is the end of the no rack coverage, so that like separates it. It's still no rack. It's not one of the other towns, but it looks a lot like the capital, so it's sometimes a toss-up. This could easily be somewhere in Ulaanbaatar, but a few tips. Erdenet's a bit more hilly within the town proper, so that's usually a good indication if you're like driving on a hill. And then the town itself looks smaller if you're close to the outskirts. And while the center of town's not as flat as the capital, the hills around are actually smaller, and they have a few trees on them if you zoom in and squint. So that's usually not true of Ulaanbaatar if you see trees on top of the hills. So now let's go quickly because Maroon here, there's a lot of coverage, but it's pretty hard to tell it apart from other towns. A lot of cloudy coverage. Um, and there are other examples with cloudy coverage that I'm not covering though. There's small mountains to the north and south. It's starting to look pretty green because it's close to the north. When we actually go to the north, Hatgal's this small resort town, and as best I can understand anyway, but it's easy to recognize. You have a lot of trees. These are Mongolian larches. They've turned yellow in the fall. It's also right next to Lake Kovsgol, the largest lake in Mongolia, so you can usually see the lake from town, just off to your east. And it's by the lake, and right by the town of Hotgal, they hold the annual ice festival, which looks like an absolute blast. And again, notice that because we're so far north in the country, we have lots of trees on the hills. So all of the tips are like making sense. They're coming back. So there are lots of towns in the Rocky Mountain region on the west, and they're hard to tell apart. So I'm just going to highlight ones with like specific features, but they also have a lot of the coverage. Um, Back to basics. We're on the west, so we see the normal Mongolian Google truck with a full rack. There may be some distinctions between full rack trucks, but they're really hard to tell apart. And we see these bigger mountains. They're very rocky, not very grassy. Tsetserlag, we also have this carved figure into the side of the hill to the south. It's visible from a lot of places in town. I mean, it's hard to remember perhaps, but just picture getting a 5K in Setzer after looking around for 10 seconds and how the other people in your Battle Royale game are going to react. So it's worth it. Um, then in the city of Iliastai, it's pretty similar to Setzer just a bit further west, I should say. We've got the Rocky Mountains, and then we've got two hill landmarks to help ID the town. We have a Soyombo symbol south of town, same as you would see on the Mongolian flag, right? They've carved that into the hill, and you can see that from a lot of places. And then we also have this shrine in the center of town with this white fence around it on the hill to the right here. So, oh, yeah, I'll circle that. Both help you to pinpoint Uliastai for sure. The last city is the furthest to the west. Remember, the further west we go, the more prominent the Rocky Mountains we should expect. So Kovd has a lot of rocky outcroppings right next to town. It's pretty recognizable with some experience. There's always towns to confuse you, though, that look kind of similar, but Kovd is probably the largest. Here's just another example of Kovd coverage. Very rocky. And that's the end of the city walkthroughs. So I hope that was useful for everybody. Before we end, there's just like a few more tips that are really helpful depending on what style of game you're playing. For example, there's a lot of Genghis Khan statues. Some are trekker coverage. And there's Buddhist shrines throughout the country too. Really cool. There's too many to cover. So just trust the landscape and vegetation. If in doubt, usually get close to Ulaanbaatar. Um, if you do decide to practice with the official country map, it's important for me to point out the national park on the far west of the country because they really like to choose locations from there. It's definitely most recognizable of any of the rural coverage, I would say. If you zoom in, there's coverage on the north and in the south. So we'll start with the main road in. Looks a little bit like this. You expect to see snow on the top of all the mountains, and you got two parallel dirt tracks, which is the actual road marked on the map. You can guess where you are based on the road angle and the river to the east. And then in the north of the park, there's no road on the map. But again, they love locations in the official coverage. So it's a road up to a glacier. You see the glacier. You can just guess that far northwest part of the map or of the country. And then if you see snow on the mountains but no trees in general, this national park's always a good guess. This is another spot from the same location. They have a little tourist yurt, which is neat to see. So finally, the next big tip, I would say this one is probably especially useful if you're playing with movement. I usually play no move, and it's rare that I get to see these markers when they aren't blurred. But these are on major highways outside of Ulaanbaatar. They're placed every kilometer. And so this one, 189, 147, it's from this spot with the red arrow. And it means you're 147 kilometers west to Ulaanbaatar and 189 kilometers east to Chingiz, which I didn't cover. It's hard to recognize, but it's another city east of Ulaanbaatar. Um, I haven't mapped out where all of those markers are, what cities they indicate. And I don't see them everywhere in the country, especially because a lot of the roads in Mongolia aren't paved. But east of the capital, it tells you how far you are to the city of Chingiz. North is the distance to how far to the border, which is super useful if you can figure that out. And then, so when you're driving north, the distance mark you see is how far to get to the border. When you're driving south, you see the distance for how far it is to get to Ulaanbaatar. The highway south also has the distances to the border and distance to the capital, but annoyingly it's reversed. So the number you see going south is the distance from the capital and vice versa. Hopefully I got that right. It took me some checking to figure out what was going on there. Finally, the highway west, it tells you the distance to Ulaanbaatar, but the other side is blank. They just couldn't decide on a city to indicate, perhaps. And that's all. I hope this was useful to some folks. I know this is similar to what you might get on geotips.net, but I find they overwhelmingly focus on how to locate this country and not how to find locations within the country. And it doesn't work well on my browser anyway. So let me know if you'd like, if you have any other important tips, put them in the comments section for Mongolia. At this point, I think it's fair you can suggest other countries if you find this useful, but be aware, some countries are definitely much harder to do than others. I haven't chosen Mongolia by accident. It's really big and there's not a lot of coverage, which is perfect recipe for getting better. Thanks. I'll see you next time.